This week we look at the Triduum liturgies that will be celebrated at the Vatican, and we have details about Pope Francis meeting with Benedict XVI. Hello and welcome to this Holy Week edition of Vatican Connections. Now, the schedule for Holy Week is pretty much the same as it always has been. There's one significant change this year, and it's meant to highlight the message of Holy Thursday, the call to service, and Christ's commandment that we love one another. We'll have more on that special liturgy later in the program, along with a look at how some of our Triduum liturgies came to be what they are today. But first, let's go through what's happening in Rome this week. Pope Francis flew to Castel Gandolfo this past Saturday to meet with Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. There are a few images from that historic meeting and some details thanks to the Holy See press office. Pope Francis disembarked from the papal helicopter and was greeted by Benedict XVI. There was a warm hug between the Pope and his predecessor. The two were then taken to the papal villa and to the chapel where they would pray together before their private chat. Now, a papal kneeler had been set up for Pope Francis, but he went to the first pew instead, and Benedict XVI tried to direct the Pope to the place of honor. Pope Francis took the retired Pope's hand and said, "We are brothers," and knelt next to the retired pontiff to pray. Pope Francis also presented Pope Emeritus Benedict with an icon of Our Lady of the Humble. He told his predecessor, if I may say, "I thought of you and your gift to the Church." The two popes, present and retired, met privately for 45 minutes before having lunch together with Archbishop Ganswein and Monsignor Zwareb. It was the first time the two men have met in person since Pope Francis's election. Catholic News Service Bureau Chief Francis Rocca looks at the common points between the two popes despite their very different styles.
The news is, by definition, whatever is new. So it's no surprise that the coverage of Pope Francis' first 2 weeks has tended to emphasize what distinguishes him from his predecessor. The most evident difference is, of course, Pope Francis's outgoing, spontaneous, informal style, which stands in such a contrast to the more reserved, shy, introverted personality of Pope Benedict. Given that, it's easy to miss the important continuities between the two popes, especially with regard to some of the themes that have already emerged as real priorities for Pope Francis. Pope Francis has already made it clear, starting with his decision to name himself after St. Francis of Assisi, that he wants the Church to be close to the poor. And that message resonates especially in his case because he comes to the papacy with decades of experience as a pastor in a large urban diocese where he was able to have direct contact with the most marginalized members of society. Benedict was a theologian and a longtime professor, but as Pope, he compiled a substantial body of teaching on social and economic issues. He was notably unsparing in his criticism of the injustices of the globalized economy. At the same time, both Benedict and Francis made it clear a long time ago that the way to remedy those injustices is never to subordinate the faith to Marxism or other worldly ideologies, as so many figures in the Church, especially in Latin America, have found so tempting over the years. Pope Francis seems to be very well received by the Church's partners in ecumenical dialogue. The Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople even attended his massive inauguration, which was a historic first. But relations between Rome and the Orthodox were never better than under Benedict, to the point that by the end of his pontificate, a meeting between the Pope and the Patriarch of Moscow had come to seem a realistic prospect. So Francis's work for Christian unity will be building on that. Many have been struck by Pope Francis's expressions of respect and openness to people of no religion at all. But it was Benedict in 2011 who invited agnostic seekers of truth to the Assisi interfaith meetings for the first time. So it shouldn't have surprised us that Francis, when he warned diplomats from around the world about the greatest threats to peace, chose to quote what are probably the single most famous words uttered by his predecessor, Benedict's denunciation of the dictatorship of relativism.
dittatura del relativismo.
So as we watch Francis's pontificate unfold, we need to remember that there is far more uniting these two men than separating them in all the areas that matter most.
Earlier in the week, Pope Francis met with foreign diplomats who are accredited to the Holy See. He spoke about material poverty, but said that's not the only type of poverty in the world.
Ma c'è anche un'altra povertà, è la povertà spirituale dei nostri giorni, che riguarda gravemente anche i paesi considerati più ricchi. È quanto il mio predecessore, il caro e venerato Benedetto XVI, chiama la dittatura del relativismo, che lascia ognuno come misura di se stesso e mette in pericolo la convivenza tra gli uomini. E così giungo ad una seconda ragione del mio nome. Francesco d'Assisi ci dice: lavorate per edificare la pace, ma non vi è vera pace senza verità. Non vi può essere pace vera se ciascuno è la misura di se stesso, se ciascuno può rivendicare sempre solo il proprio diritto senza curarsi allo stesso tempo del bene degli altri, di tutti, a partire dalla natura che accomuna ogni essere umano su questa terra.
A new papal tradition seems to be taking hold at the Vatican. Pope Francis is still living at the Domus Sancta Marta, and for several days now, he has celebrated morning Mass in the chapel there with groundskeepers and other Vatican City maintenance staff. And since his election, he has also been asking the faithful for one thing: prayers. Now, we're all praying for him during Mass, but one cardinal made a pilgrimage to a very special place to pray for the new Pope.
When I was in the Sistine Chapel and the Holy Father announced that he had chosen the name Francis, I thought, now I must go to Assisi as soon as I can, where I've so many times been for prayers for my Diocese of San Francisco in California, so I can ask the intercession of his patron saint, Italy's patron saint, for his new Petrine ministry. So accompanied by the two sisters from my house, we got able to come today, and I'm delighted to have a chance to visit the tomb of St. Francis and to pray here for our Holy Father, Pope Francis. I'm going to tell him when I get back to Rome before heading back to San Francisco that I made this pilgrimage for him and to pray for him, and he's a man who says always at the end, pray for me, pray for me. So I want him to know that I'm taking his admonition seriously, and especially here at the tomb of his patron, Francis.
Turning to more worldly matters, we've learned that Pope Francis has decided he will not move into the Apostolic Palace. Instead, he will stay at the Domus Sancta Marta, the official Vatican guest house. He has moved out of the room he was living in during the conclave and into a nicer suite. According to the Holy See, Pope Francis made the decision because he likes being able to take his meals in the dining room with other residents and celebrate daily Mass in the chapel with staff and residents. Did you know, in many places it is customary to visit several different churches after Holy Thursday Mass? It's a way to commemorate the time Jesus spent praying in the Garden of Olives on this night. As we mentioned at the beginning of the program, the Holy Week schedule remains the same year to year, but Pope Francis has introduced one significant change. Holy Thursday consists of two separate Masses, one in the morning and one traditionally in the late afternoon. During the morning Mass, the oil of chrism is consecrated, and this is the oil that's used for anointing during baptism and confirmations throughout the year. In the afternoon, the Holy Father and bishops and priests around the world celebrate the Mass commemorating the Lord's Supper. Traditionally, this Mass is celebrated in Rome at the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral of Rome. This year, Pope Francis is introducing one of his own traditions. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he would celebrate Holy Thursday Mass at a center for young offenders or at a center that helps the poor or the sick. This year, he will celebrate this liturgy at the Casal del Marmo jail for young offenders. The young people there are able to learn a trade and be prepared to enter the workforce upon their release. This Mass will not be televised, so it will be just the Holy Father and the young inmates. The Mass of the Lord's Supper is a reminder of the Lord's commandment to love one another as he loves us. Now, the Holy See said in a statement, the Holy Father's decision to celebrate in a jail for young offenders is a powerful reminder of this commandment. Previous popes would wash the feet of 12 retired priests from the Diocese of Rome. On Friday, there is no Mass per se, but there is a liturgy which Pope Francis will preside over. This is the liturgy that begins in silence, with the presider prostrating himself in front of the altar and with the faithful venerating the cross during the service. The act of venerating the cross was introduced into the liturgy in the 7th or 8th century. Although there is no consecration of the bread and wine, there is communion using hosts that were consecrated the day before. This liturgy commemorated Christ's passion and death and is celebrated much the same way around the world. In the evening, Pope Francis will go to Rome's Colosseum to lead the Stations of the Cross. Now, it was Pope Paul VI who introduced the tradition of praying the Stations of the Cross at the Colosseum in 1964. The practice was begun by Saint Leonard of Porto Maurizio, an Italian monk who promoted the practice of the Stations of the Cross and set up stations in over 500 locations across Italy, including the Roman Colosseum. At first, Pope Paul VI led a scriptural Via Crucis, then, in 1971, used meditations written by Leo the Great. In 1972, he used texts written by St. Augustine and so forth. John Paul II personally wrote meditations on the stations in 1984, but then he took to asking different people to write meditations every year. That tradition has been continued, and this year's meditations were written by a group of Lebanese youth working with the Maronite Patriarch Bekkar Rai. The highlight of the week comes with the Easter Vigil liturgy on Saturday evening. This long liturgy begins in darkness with the blessing of the fire. St. Cyril of Jerusalem spoke of Constantine adding the use of torches to the ceremonies. Private homes and basilicas would light great torches so that the entire city would be resplendent with the light of the risen Christ. Catechumens, or adults who have gone through the rite of Christian initiation, are also baptized during this Mass every year. And then, of course, on Easter Sunday morning, the Pope celebrates the Mass of the day and gives his Urbi et Orbi blessing, or his blessing to the city and the world. Previous popes have taken the opportunity to deliver Easter greetings in multiple languages to the faithful of all nations. In the last few weeks, we've gotten many questions from our viewers by email and by Facebook and Twitter, and we're going to answer some of them. Pierre sent us an email asking, I wonder if you could tell me who the priest or attendant is on the Pope's left side wearing the glasses. He's always directing the Pope and sort of guiding him where to read and do certain things. Well, Pierre, there are two attendants with the Pope. One is Monsignor Guido Marini, the Master of Apostolic Ceremonies, and the other is Monsignor Francesco Camaldo. Their job is to make sure everything the Pope needs is right there when he needs it during a liturgy, and to prepare everyone who has a part in the Mass. Vatican Connections is interactive. Send us your questions or comments by Facebook, Twitter, email, or post. Via email, send comments to info@saltandlighttv.org, and by post, send letters to 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1, Canada. In this week's Roman Profile, Catholic News Service brings us a look at the two saints who inspire our two popes, the Pope Emeritus and the current Holy Father.
The last two popes have chosen names that recall those of the founders of two of the Church's great religious families, the Benedictines and the Franciscans. We know the retired pope is devoted to St. Benedict's monastic ideal of ora et labora, pray and labor, which was the inspiration for Pope Benedict's idea of creative minorities, groups that could preserve and defend the faith through the new dark ages of secularism. Now Pope Francis has identified himself as a disciple of St. Francis of Assisi, who enjoined his friars to take the monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But instead of keeping them inside the cloister, Francis sent his friars out into the world, particularly the growing cities of 13th century Europe. Probably the single most striking difference between the traditions is the radical corporate poverty that St. Francis required. Unlike the monks, the friars had no guarantee from one day to the next that they would have a meal or a place to stay. As G.K. Chesterton pointed out in his book about St. Francis almost a century ago, this allowed the Franciscans to expand very quickly because they had no overhead expenses. But it also meant that they were radically dependent on the people that they were ministering to. So in effect, they drew out the charity of everybody else through their own poverty. So these are two different charisms that ultimately serve the same end. And as a reminder that they drew from the same source, you can visit the Benedictine monastery at Subiaco, about an hour's drive east of Rome, where you can see the cave where the young Benedict of Nursia spent 3 years discovering his vocation. And a few steps away, you can see a beautiful fresco of St. Francis of Assisi, painted from life, when he came there as a pilgrim 7 centuries later in search of inspiration for his own mission.
Well, that's it for this week's edition of Vatican Connections. Next week, we'll bring you full coverage of all the Holy Week events from Rome. And from everyone here, thanks for watching.